Logan, everyone. Tom Nagorski in the Cipher Brief virtual studio. Welcome to another one of our conversations today, looking at what has been a busy and somewhat stressful week for Taiwan. Large-scale Chinese military drills held off the coast, simulating both strikes against the island and a blockade, actually. We might get into that too. And a lot of nasty rhetoric from the mainland that went with it. We're delighted to be joined today by Isaac Stonefish, CEO and founder of Strategy Risks, which measures business risk in China. Interesting time to be talking about that subject too. Isaac lived in China for 7 years. He's the author of America's Second, a book about Beijing's influence in the U.S. And Isaac Stonefish, it's great to have you with us. And as you know better than most, I guess drills, even big ones like the ones we've seen this week, are not in and of themselves, that unusual. But help us to put in perspective, if you could, what we've seen over a couple of days now going on in the waters and the skies near Taiwan.
Thanks, Tom. Drills are not unusual until they are. And what Beijing has been doing steadily for the last several years is both raising the temperature around Taiwan, but also decreasing the steps it would have to take to mount an invasion. And so when you're doing drills and when you can try to normalize increased military presence around the island, it should therefore be easier to transform a drill into an attack. Now, very difficult, if not impossible, to say when something like that might happen and whether or not that's Beijing's plans, but it's certainly a possibility and certainly something that folks have to keep in mind.
And on the, I was going to wait a bit, but you sort of got to the calendar part of this. I mean, for years, I think the assumption is that Xi Jinping is hoping at least to be prepared if, big if, he chooses the military option for reunification, as he calls it, with Taiwan to sort of end of 2026, I think he said. Scholars and people like yourself probably have kicked around different dates. Is that still the operative calendar to the extent we on the other side of the world can even think about that?
It's still the narrative, but I think it's the wrong narrative. Xi Jinping will invade Taiwan not when the military or China is ready, but when he thinks it makes the right sense for him. And that'll be tomorrow or in 2 weeks or in 2027 or in 2034 or never. These things are devilishly difficult to predict, and we don't want to pretend that. One of my least favorite expressions is the Chinese play the long game. The Chinese are human beings and they think like the rest of the world in that it's very, very difficult to make long-term plans and people must update their plans based on reality. China's economy would be so much less successful if they actually followed their 5-year plans. And so folks who are interested in nerding out, read a 5-year plan 5 years after it was implemented and try to compare that to where China went in that timeline. It's radically different.
Right. Okay. Well, now you keep putting questions in my mind that I wasn't even going to ask. But what? So if it could be tomorrow or it could be in 2034, I think is your. What might prompt it to happen sooner then? What would be a? I mean, there's provocative language always, especially since President Lai was elected last year in Taiwan. Are there, in all these scenarios, what moves the calendar up, if you will, from Beijing's standpoint?
So one of the things we do at Strategy Risks is track indications of potential invasion. And some of these are prosaic but important. Weather makes a very big deal when you're trying to launch an aquatic invasion. Domestic Chinese politics, which are very, very hard to read at the high level. In terms of external dynamics, our view is that the more the U.S. shows support for Taiwan, the less likely China is to invade. And people misuse the word provocative. So when then Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan several years ago, I think that trip was the opposite of provocative because it showed U.S. resolve and it should make it less likely for China to invade. Because I think the question that Beijing needs to answer about a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is less, I think, some question of Chinese readiness and more, will the United States and will Japan get involved in this war? It's a radically different war if it's just China versus Taiwan or China versus South Korea, Japan, Philippines, and the United States.
Okay, so then let's go to a bit of a view from Taipei, I guess, to this question about whether the U.S. gets involved, which, by the way, seems like tea leaf reading as difficult almost as reading tea leaves in Beijing, right? But you can imagine, and there are people here who game this out, maybe you do too, there's an argument that says, well, there's a lot of people in Trump's national security world whose whole point about Ukraine is we need to get out of there and out of that because China is what matters, and defending Taiwan and being strong over there is what matters, and the whole point about passage through the straits and all the rest. And then there's the others who say, no, he just threw the Ukrainians under the bus. I'm paraphrasing, to make deals with Vladimir Putin. And so if Trump is going to go, what's to stop him from making deals with Xi Jinping that have the same impact in Taipei? That's a very long way of asking which of those looks right to you, if any.
With the caveat that predictions are incredibly difficult.
Yes.
My view is the base case now is US and China make a deal. China doesn't necessarily believe the deal, so it pushes on Taiwan. Maybe it seizes Kinmen or Matsu. Maybe there's a massive cyber attack. Maybe more cables get severed. The US doesn't respond forcefully, and China decides to invade, and does so without much US pushback in, say, 2028. And Japan gets involved, Czech Republic, Lithuania, Philippines perhaps get involved, and the US joins the war later. I think we again, hard to know how much history is a guide, but it took the US several years to get into World War I and World War II as well. And I think we'll probably sit out the beginning of World War III until there's a new leader in the White House. I don't think President Trump wants to be a wartime president. I think he is arguably more anti-war than any US president we've had since Carter. And I think if Beijing is trying to figure out what's the right time to invade, it's a pretty good one for them, unfortunately.
Well, and also it took us, let's say, 7 minutes and 20 seconds to get to our first mention of World War III. Oh, dear. Different question about the U.S. Position, which also surfaced this week. The Washington Post reported, I'm sure you saw, a secret Pentagon, they called it an interim internal guidance memo, which had been signed by the defense secretary, that called for the U.S. Military to prioritize deterring a Chinese takeover of Taiwan. Here's a quote from their piece. The quote that they say is from the memo, denial of a Chinese fait accompli seizure of Taiwan while simultaneously defending the U.S. homeland is the department's sole pacing scenario. That's Pete Hegseth. Thoughts about that?
I hope that's accurate, and I hope that is what the U.S. government does. I think, as we all know, war is a political decision. It's not a military decision. And the decision about whether or not to go to war with China if China invades Taiwan, frankly, probably depends on both President Trump and who he's listening to in that period. So I think it's very important for the US DoD to prioritize deterring a Chinese invasion and weakening Chinese warfighting capabilities and working to stop US companies supporting the PLA, which still happens with brazen regularity. Besides that, it is a question for President Trump.
Recognizing excellence in national security. The Cipher Brief Honors Dinner celebrates those who've made a real difference in protecting our nation. It's an unforgettable evening with top leaders in the field. Join us in honoring these remarkable contributions. Reserve your seat now at cipherbriefhonors.com.
One more question about the military situation with Taiwan. The exercises this week have also simulated a blockade. And as you know, there have been those who have thought, well, perhaps this is ultimately going to be Xi Jinping's game, because with a blockade, you can accomplish a lot of what you may set out to do. You do it without too much bloodshed. No way, they might think, the United States or others are going to come to Taiwan's aid in that circumstance. What are your thoughts about all of that?
We strongly encourage businesses to understand that the goods they get from China, not only with tariffs and other political realities, but might just stop coming for a meaningful period of time and to price that in to your China import strategy. On the actual question of a blockade, I mean, I think one can say there's been a de facto blockade outside of China, mostly set up by China, but also to a degree by US regulations on it. And so I think in this world, we tend to use the term blockade in a bit too old-fashioned of a way and just think, ships patrolling a harbor, as opposed to the other factors that make it difficult for goods to go from one place to another.
Yeah. Okay. And then since I asked you what might move the calendar up to a Chinese decision to actually invade, what might push it in the other direction? What we've had such a, I guess you could call it a kind of incendiary week in that part of the world. What lowers the flames a little? What might?
The honest answer to that question depends on relations between Xi Jinping and the other members of the Standing Committee and the two vice chairmen of the Central Military Commission. And we don't have access to that information. And I would be surprised if anyone, outside of a few hundred people in China, has that access. I certainly hope our government does, but I do not know. I think beyond the real answer to the question, the things that we can glean, Japanese resolve is incredibly important. Japan has arguably a lot more to lose from Taiwan going to the mainland because of the nearness between Taiwan and Ishigaki and Okinawa and other Japanese islands. Filipino resolve, I think, would help, if not just to distract from Taiwan and focus attention on the Philippines. And then a grand deal between China and the United States that didn't involve the U.S. reducing its support for Taiwan.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I said before we started here, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, given what you do for a living, about something totally different. As we speak, the markets are getting roiled by the tariff news. And, trade war is a loosely, probably too often used term, but pretty safe to say we're in one right now. Again, we're a national security platform. Talk, if you could, about what you think the implications, if there are any, from a national security standpoint, there may be from what the Trump administration has just done, and of course all the responses that are, if they haven't happened already, are about to come from Beijing.
Okay, massive national security implications. One is the reshaping of military supply chains. The other is the link between the U.S. military and major weapons producers who still import quite a bit from China, especially RTX. The other is how this may continue to fracture the relations between U.S. and allies, not only on intelligence sharing, but just on willingness to work together in the case of an invasion. And then I think also there's the question of distraction. Is there going to be focus on just economics, or are we going to keep economics and national security where they need to be? I think I'm going to the airport in a bit, so my mind is on TSA. And there's hard to think of a better example of fighting the last war than people having to take off their shoes at airport security and not thinking at all about what a future attack might look like. And so I do hope that national security plays a big role in the conversation. And certainly part of the justification, from folks in the Trump administration, both publicly and privately, about the tariffs on China is squarely aligned with national security. But I think a lot of times people miss that part of the message.
You mean squarely aligned in the sense that it's a tool to implement some policies, right? But can you just explain a bit more about the first point you made, military supply chains? I'm not sure most people know. And are they likely to get exempted in some way, or is that cat out of the bag now?
There's a real problem. So one of the things Strategy Risks does, we rank companies on their China exposure, and some military companies rank quite highly on that, which is stunning. So RTX is in our top 10, and they have pretty heavy supply chain exposure to China. And companies will often say, hey, we don't import weapons from China, we import other things from China. But the exposure to China and the ability of them to jeopardize certain lines of your business is incredibly impactful. Boeing is a very clear example of that. Boeing is mostly Boeing government, which is a weapons contractor, and Boeing commercial, which makes planes. And the aviation side of the business is heavily exposed to China. The Chinese Communist Party is Boeing's second largest customer. gets roughly, I think it's 10 to 15% of its revenue from China. And so understanding that exposure and how tariffs are going to change that equation is really important, because the justification for tariffs is to bring manufacturing back to the United States. Whether or not that will actually happen is very difficult to say, but companies like Boeing and RTX are almost certainly, and if not, they need to understand the pricing of importing from China is beyond the cost of goods and has all of these other externalities. And tariffs are, in a way, a tool to try to correct those externalities.
And what then are the, not to belabor this point, but what then are the weapons or the weapon systems or other stuff that the United States may be in peril of not getting or having to pay much, much more for?
Critical minerals is a big piece of that. Those are essential. The existence of DGI and their prominence in America is quite dangerous from a defense perspective.
The electric vehicle maker,
the drone maker,
the drone maker,
yes.
Yeah.
And the Skydio, I believe, is the United States' biggest domestic drone maker, and they have or had China as a choke point technology in their supply chain, and so. These weapon systems are mostly maddeningly complex. And so the idea isn't that, the entire tank or missile, gets made in a Chinese factory and shipped to the United States. It's that there's choke point technologies in China or controlled by China that would make it far more difficult or far more expensive to manufacture certain items without China being part of the supply chain.
And then last question, Isaac, the other point you made about the national security implication, not of things per se, but the willingness of allies in the event of a U.S.-China conflict. Game that out to us is the notion that as some of our longest-term allies get punished by the trade war, they may not be willing to lift fingers to help us. And is that the notion? So
Canada has a lot to lose from a dominant China. And 6 months ago, I would say pretty absolutely that the U.S. and Canada would work together to push back against China. They're certainly not aligning on that right now because of President Trump's attacks on Canada. And so one could see a scenario where tensions increase or there's a war and Canada doesn't involve itself at the same level that it would before. Very difficult to know, when push comes to shove, who's going to join, when they're going to join. But this is going to be almost certainly, well, it's hard to imagine any way it could not be an allied conflict. And so what type of alliances would we have, and how much are we able to use our real weapon against China, which is the system of alliances we've built over the decades? Yeah, we'll have to leave it there. Isaac Stonefish, CEO and founder of Strategy Risks. Go get your plane. Thank you so much for being with us at the Cipher Brief. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Tom. Great chat.